At 3:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday morning, three Chinese Type 052D guided missile destroyers positioned themselves across the primary shipping channel at the eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz, refusing passage to two United States Navy supply vessels bound for the Fifth Fleet operating area in the Persian Gulf. What happened over the next 48 hours would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the most strategically vital waterway on Earth, through which 21% of the world's petroleum supply passes every single day. The Chinese warships, the Kunming, the Changsha, and the Yinchuan, formed a blocking formation 17 nautical miles east of the narrowest point of the strait, where the channel constricts to just 21 miles in width between Oman and Iran. Each destroyer displaces 7,500 tons, measures 515 feet in length, carries a crew of 280, and is armed with 64 vertical launch cells capable of firing HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles with a range of 125 miles, YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 290 miles, and CY-5 anti-submarine rockets. The vessels had departed their base at Djibouti 72 hours earlier, ostensibly conducting freedom of navigation operations in international waters, but their positioning blocking the primary traffic separation scheme told a different story entirely. The two American supply ships, the USNS Wally Schirra and the USNS Matthew Perry, both Lewis and Clark-class dry cargo vessels operated by Military Sealift Command, were carrying 7,150 tons of supplies, including ammunition, spare parts, food, and fuel for the carrier strike group USS Abraham Lincoln operating in the Persian Gulf. The Wally Schirra is 689 feet long, can carry 14 million pounds of cargo, and serves as a critical link in the logistics chain that enables sustained American naval presence 5,000 miles from home ports. When Chinese destroyers refused to allow passage and issued radio warnings that any attempt to proceed would be met with defensive measures, the supply vessels held position and requested instructions from United States Central Command. This was not a random encounter. This was a calculated challenge to American freedom of navigation, executed with precision timing while global attention focused on escalating tensions between Russia and Ukraine. While oil prices had already climbed to $127 per barrel on supply disruption fears, while the United States faced domestic political divisions over military commitments abroad, and while China tested whether Washington would defend its access to the Persian Gulf with the same resolve it had historically defended access through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. The answer to that question would arrive exactly 48 hours later in a form that Beijing did not anticipate and cannot now undo. Understanding why China chose this moment and this location requires examining three converging factors that created what Chinese strategists believed was an exploitable opening. First, the geographic bottleneck of the Strait of Hormuz represents the single most vulnerable point in global energy infrastructure, where disruption produces immediate worldwide economic impact measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Second, China imports 6 million barrels of oil per day, with 43% of that volume transiting through Hormuz from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq, giving Beijing legitimate security interests in this waterway that it could invoke to justify expanded naval presence. Third, the deployment of 3 destroyers represented the largest Chinese surface combatant presence ever maintained in the Persian Gulf simultaneously, testing whether the United States would accept Chinese military parity in waters Washington has dominated since 1949. The economic stakes of this confrontation extend far beyond the immediate supply disruption to 2 American vessels. The Strait of Hormuz handles approximately 18 million barrels of crude oil daily, plus an additional 3 million barrels of petroleum products, representing 35% of all seaborne traded oil globally. The total value of petroleum flowing through this 21-mile-wide channel exceeds $1, $4 billion per day at current prices. Every day the strait remains disrupted or contested, global oil inventories decline by 18 million barrels. Prices spike between $8 and $15 per barrel. Inflation accelerates across every economy on Earth, and the probability of broader military conflict increases by measurable percentage points. For the United States specifically, disruption of Fifth Fleet supply lines threatens the operational capability of the carrier strike group USS Abraham Lincoln, which requires 600,000 gallons of fuel per day to maintain flight operations, defensive patrols, and tactical positioning. The strike group's 90 combat aircraft consume 85,000 gallons of jet fuel per day during normal operations and up to 240,000 gallons per day during intensive combat operations. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers escorting the carrier, USS Spruance, USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., and USS Michael Murphy, each burn 1,100 gallons of fuel per hour at cruising speed and maintain magazines requiring constant ammunition replenishment to sustain defensive capabilities against the Iranian missile and drone threat that remains active despite recent setbacks. China's strategic calculation rested on several assumptions about American willingness to escalate over what Beijing characterized as a legitimate exercise of navigation rights in international waters. Chinese military planners believed the United States would not risk military confrontation with a nuclear-armed great power over access rights to supply vessels when alternative routing through the Gulf of Oman and around the Arabian Peninsula remained available, albeit at significant time and fuel cost. They assessed that domestic American political opposition to foreign military commitments would constrain presidential decision-making authority to authorize kinetic operations against Chinese vessels. They calculated that the economic costs of potential Chinese retaliation against American commercial interests would outweigh the tactical value of forcing passage for two supply ships. Every single one of these assumptions would prove catastrophically incorrect within 48 hours. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what the United States did next represents the most significant demonstration of naval power projection since Operation Praying Mantis in 1988. And you need to understand exactly how Washington just redefined the rules of engagement in the world's most critical maritime choke point. The American response began not in the Persian Gulf, but in the Pacific, where the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group was conducting routine operations east of Okinawa, Japan. At 11:43 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, approximately 20 hours after the initial Chinese blockade, United States Indo-Pacific Command issued movement orders to the Reagan Strike Group directing immediate transit to the Indian Ocean via the Strait of Malacca. The Reagan is a Nimitz-class supercarrier displacing 97,000 tons, measuring 1,092 feet in length, powered by two nuclear reactors that provide effectively unlimited range, carrying 75 combat aircraft, and escorted by two Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers and four Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. The entire strike group began moving southwest at 28 knots, a sprint speed that would position them in the Arabian Sea within 72 hours. Simultaneously, United States Central Command activated Operation Adamant Shield, a pre-planned contingency for contested access scenarios in the Strait of Hormuz. The plan had been developed and refined over 18 months following increasing Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean and involved coordinated positioning of naval, air, and cyber assets designed to establish overwhelming local superiority within 96 hours of activation. The operation's name was itself a message: adamant. Unyielding, inflexible, a shield that would not break and could not be moved. The first visible American move came at 6:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 27 hours after the Chinese blockade began. The submarine USS Hawaii, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine operating beneath the surface of the Gulf of Oman, surfaced directly between the Chinese destroyer formation and the Omani coastline. Virginia-class submarines are 377 feet long, displace 7,800 tons, carry a crew of 135, can dive to depths exceeding 800 feet, reach submerged speeds of 34 knots, and are armed with 12 vertical launch tubes for Tomahawk cruise missiles, plus 4 torpedo tubes loaded with Mark 48 heavyweight torpedoes capable of sinking any surface combatant on Earth. The Hawaii surfaced. It did not need to fire anything. It simply needed to be visible. The surfacing maneuver communicated 3 messages simultaneously to Chinese commanders. First, American submarines had been tracking the Chinese destroyers continuously since they departed Djibouti, demonstrating complete intelligence awareness and battlefield preparation. Second, the submarine was positioned such that any Chinese attempt to enforce their blockade with weapons would immediately bring them within torpedo range of a platform they could neither detect nor defend against effectively. Third, the United States possessed assets in position to sink all three Chinese destroyers within minutes should conflict escalate, fundamentally changing the risk calculus of continued confrontation. But the submarine was only the opening move. At 9:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers departed Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri on what the Air Force described as a routine long-range training mission. B-2 bombers can fly 6,000 miles without refueling, carry 40,000 pounds of ordnance, including GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs weighing 30,000 pounds each, and possess radar cross-sections so minimal that they appear on radar screens as objects no larger than birds. The bombers flew south across the Atlantic, conducted 3 aerial refuelings from KC-135 tankers positioned over the Mediterranean, and continued southeast across Saudi Arabia toward the Arabian Sea. Chinese satellite reconnaissance detected the bomber movement approximately 8 hours into the flight, triggering urgent communications between the destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz and the Chinese Southern Theater Command responsible for naval operations in the Indian Ocean. The problem Chinese commanders faced was that B-2 bombers carrying precision-guided munitions could strike surface vessels from altitudes and ranges where ship-based air defenses provide no effective protection. The HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles aboard the Chinese destroyers have demonstrated hit probabilities below 20% against stealth aircraft, and that assumes the missiles can even achieve target lock before weapons release from platforms they struggle to detect. The bombers did not need to attack. Their presence in the battle space created a threat environment where Chinese defensive systems were inadequate to protect their own vessels. At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, exactly 48 hours after the Chinese blockade began, the United States executed the operational component of its response with surgical precision and overwhelming force that left no ambiguity about American resolve or capability. 4 F/A-18E Super Hornets launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln accelerated to 8 times the speed of sound, and conducted low-altitude supersonic passes directly over the 3 Chinese destroyers at an altitude of 800 feet. The aircraft did not arm weapons. They did not lock targeting radar. They simply flew over the vessels at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, creating sonic booms that rattled every piece of equipment on those ships, and demonstrated that American pilots could reach the Chinese destroyers whenever they chose, and from whatever angle they chose. The sonic boom maneuver achieved its intended effect within minutes. The destroyer Kunming immediately radioed the American supply vessels USNS Wally Schirra and USNS Matthew Perry, informing them that the Chinese formation was adjusting position to continue their navigation exercise, and that the traffic separation scheme was open for all vessels exercising legitimate passage rights. The Chinese destroyers moved northeast, clearing the shipping channel they had blocked for 48 hours. The American supply vessels proceeded through the Strait of Hormuz without further incident, delivered their cargo to the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, and continued their logistics mission exactly as planned. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. The United States did not stop with simply forcing the Chinese vessels to back down. What happened next revealed a level of strategic planning and intelligence preparation that fundamentally altered Chinese calculations about future confrontations in this region. At 4:33 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 hours after the Chinese destroyers cleared the shipping channel, United States Cyber Command executed a coordinated cyber operation against the Chinese satellite network that provides communications relay and reconnaissance coverage for naval operations in the Indian Ocean. The operation did not destroy the satellites. It did not create debris fields that would violate international space law or trigger escalation. Instead, American cyber operators exploited vulnerabilities in the satellite control systems to temporarily jam specific communication frequencies used for secure military transmissions, while leaving civilian and commercial satellite functions completely unaffected. The jamming lasted exactly 90 minutes, during which time the 3 Chinese destroyers lost encrypted communication links with their command authority in Beijing and had to rely on unsecure commercial satellite phones and high-frequency radio that American electronic warfare systems intercepted and recorded in real time. The cyber operation accomplished 2 strategic objectives that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Strait of Hormuz. First, it demonstrated to Chinese military planners that their command and control architecture for distant naval operations possesses exploitable vulnerabilities that American cyber capabilities can attack whenever Washington chooses, creating permanent uncertainty about whether Chinese vessels operating thousands of miles from home ports can maintain secure communication with their command authority during crisis situations. Second, it provided United States intelligence agencies with 90 minutes of unsecured Chinese military communications that revealed operational procedures, decision-making protocols, and authorization requirements that will inform American planning for future confrontations. The economic implications of this 48-hour confrontation rippled through global markets with immediate measurable impact. Oil prices, which had spiked to $134 per barrel on rumors that the Chinese blockade might trigger broader conflict in the Persian Gulf, dropped $18 per barrel within 4 hours of the Chinese destroyers clearing the shipping channel. That price movement represented $324 million in avoided daily costs for American consumers at gasoline pumps alone, not counting broader economic impacts on transportation, manufacturing, and electricity generation. Global equity markets, which had declined to 3% during the 48-hour standoff on fears of energy supply disruption, rallied 8% as the crisis resolved without kinetic conflict. For China specifically, the economic consequences extend beyond immediate market movements to long-term strategic positioning. Beijing imports petroleum through the Strait of Hormuz worth approximately $467 million per day at current prices. The 48-hour confrontation demonstrated that China cannot protect those imports against American interdiction should future crises escalate to economic warfare. Chinese strategists who had hoped to establish Chinese naval presence in the Persian Gulf as a counterweight to American dominance must now confront the reality that the United States possesses military capabilities in this region that China cannot match and cannot defend against with current force structure. The diplomatic fallout from this confrontation reveals fractures in relationships and exposes competing interests that will shape great power competition for years to come. China's ambassador to the United Nations issued a statement calling the American response provocative and disproportionate, claiming that Chinese vessels were conducting legitimate freedom of navigation operations in international waters when they were subjected to unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers by United States aircraft. The statement conspicuously avoided mentioning that Chinese destroyers had refused passage to American supply vessels for 48 hours, instead framing the incident as unprovoked American aggression against Chinese maritime rights. The Gulf Cooperation Council nations, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman, issued a collective statement expressing concern about militarization of the Strait of Hormuz while conspicuously failing to criticize either American or Chinese actions by name. This studied neutrality reflects the complex position these nations occupy, dependent on American military protection for security, while simultaneously courting Chinese investment and energy imports as insurance against American abandonment. Their refusal to explicitly support the American response, despite their overwhelming dependence on unrestricted access through Hormuz, signals their calculation that future regional stability may require accommodation with Chinese power projection rather than exclusive alignment with Washington. Russia's response proved particularly revealing. Moscow issued a perfunctory statement calling for all parties to exercise restraint and resolve disputes through diplomatic channels, notably failing to explicitly support its supposed strategic partner China or condemn American military operations. This rhetorical distance reflects Russian calculations that Chinese expansion into regions Moscow considers within its sphere of influence actually threatens Russian interests, despite the public performance of strategic alignment. Russia sells petroleum to China at negotiated rates below market price as part of their partnership arrangement. Chinese ability to secure Persian Gulf imports directly without Russian intermediation reduces Moscow's leverage in that relationship and threatens one of Russia's few remaining sources of economic influence over Beijing. The most consequential diplomatic development, however, occurred not through public statements, but through private communications between Washington and capitals across the Middle East and Asia. According to sources familiar with the discussions, the United States delivered clear messages to governments throughout the region that American commitment to maintaining freedom of navigation through critical maritime choke points remains absolute and non-negotiable. The private messaging emphasized that any nation facilitating Chinese military presence in the Persian Gulf through basing rights, logistics support, or intelligence sharing would face consequences including reduced American security cooperation, restricted access to advanced weapons systems, and potential economic measures targeting specific sectors. This private diplomatic pressure campaign achieved immediate results. Within 72 hours of the confrontation's resolution, Djibouti quietly informed Chinese naval authorities that planned expansion of Chinese naval facilities at the Djibouti base would face delays pending environmental and commercial reviews, effectively freezing construction that would have enabled China to maintain larger destroyer formations in the Indian Ocean theater. Oman, which had been negotiating potential port access agreements with Chinese shipping companies that could have dual military-civilian applications, suspended those negotiations pending further study. Pakistan, which operates the Chinese-built port at Gwadar with potential naval applications, issued new restrictions on foreign military vessel visits that happened to exclude Chinese warship types currently operating in the Indian Ocean. The historical parallels to this confrontation illuminate both its significance and its potential trajectory. The most direct comparison reaches back to Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988, when the United States Navy responded to Iranian mining of international waters by destroying 2 Iranian oil platforms, sinking 1 Iranian frigate, and damaging 1 Iranian corvette in a single day of coordinated operations. That operation established a precedent that challenges to American naval supremacy in the Persian Gulf would be met with immediate and overwhelming force, a precedent that remained unchallenged for 36 years until Chinese destroyers attempted to block American supply vessels. The current confrontation differs from 1988 in one critical dimension. Iran in 1988 was a regional power without nuclear weapons, without great power backing, and without the economic leverage to threaten global markets beyond petroleum exports. China in 2024 is a nuclear-armed great power with the world's largest manufacturing economy, the second largest military budget, permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and economic relationships that touch every nation on Earth. Forcing Chinese naval vessels to back down carries risks and potential costs that forcing Iranian capitulation never approached. That the United States chose to do so anyway sends a message about American strategic priorities that extends far beyond this specific incident. A second historical parallel emerges from the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the United States enforced a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent Soviet delivery of nuclear missiles and forced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to back down after 13 days of confrontation that brought humanity closer to nuclear war than any event before or since. The comparison is not perfect. The current confrontation involved no nuclear weapons deployment, lasted only 48 hours rather than 13 days, and resolved through calibrated military demonstrations rather than through blockade and negotiated settlement. But the fundamental dynamic remains identical. A nuclear-armed great power challenged American resolve in a region Washington considers strategically vital. An American willingness to escalate forced the challenger to retreat. What happens next will determine whether this 48-hour confrontation represents an isolated incident or the opening move in sustained great power competition for control of the maritime domains that enable global commerce and energy supply. China faces a decision about whether to treat this outcome as a temporary tactical setback requiring adjusted timing and methodology, or whether to fundamentally reassess their strategy for projecting power into regions where American military advantages remain overwhelming. The United States faces parallel decisions about whether to accept Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf as an inevitable consequence of Chinese economic growth, or whether to actively contain Chinese military expansion through demonstrations of resolve like the one just executed. The clock is running on several intersecting timelines that will reveal which path this confrontation has set in motion. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group will arrive in the Arabian Sea within 36 hours, establishing a 2-carrier American presence in the region that has not existed since operations against the Islamic State in Syria concluded. Chinese naval planners must decide whether to maintain their 3 destroyers in the region where they now face overwhelming American superiority or withdraw them to avoid further humiliation. Regional governments courted by both Washington and Beijing must calculate which side offers more credible security guarantees and more sustainable partnerships as great power competition intensifies. The broader question that remains unresolved is whether this confrontation accelerates or delays inevitable conflict over Taiwan. Chinese strategists who advocated testing American resolve in the Persian Gulf rather than in the Taiwan Strait have just received definitive evidence that American willingness to defend its interests extends to every theater globally, not just to regions where treaty commitments or domestic political pressure compel intervention. That knowledge may cause Beijing to delay any move against Taiwan until Chinese military capabilities improve sufficiently to overcome American advantages. Alternatively, Chinese leaders may conclude that waiting simply allows American advantages to compound, and that a window of opportunity exists now that will close as the United States continues military modernization and alliance strengthening. The economic reverberations of this confrontation will continue for months, regardless of immediate military outcomes. Every nation that imports petroleum through the Strait of Hormuz now faces renewed uncertainty about supply security in an environment where great powers contest access through the world's most critical maritime choke point. Energy companies will incorporate increased risk premiums into long-term supply contracts. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the strait will rise to reflect demonstrated confrontation risks. Alternative energy infrastructure investments will accelerate as nations seek to reduce dependence on vulnerable supply routes. For the 3 Chinese destroyer crews who spent 48 hours in the most dangerous maritime confrontation since the Cold War ended, the experience delivered lessons that no training exercise can replicate. They learned that American intelligence tracks their movements from the moment they leave port. They learned that American submarines can position beneath them without detection. They learned that American aircraft can reach them from ranges and altitudes their defensive systems cannot counter. They learned that their satellite communications can be jammed whenever Washington chooses. Most importantly, they learned that their command authority in Beijing cannot protect them when they operate thousands of miles from home against adversaries with local superiority. The next 72 hours will reveal whether China treats this as a lesson requiring strategic adjustment or as humiliation requiring response. The next 72 hours will show whether American allies and partners interpret this demonstration as evidence of reliable American commitment or as reckless escalation that increases regional instability. The next 72 hours will determine whether oil markets price this incident as resolved crisis or as preview of broader confrontation that threatens supply security. What remains absolutely certain is that the rules governing great power interaction in maritime domains have fundamentally changed. For 3 decades following the Cold War's end, the United States maintained uncontested naval supremacy in every ocean on Earth. China's rise challenged that supremacy, creating ambiguity about where American commitment to freedom of navigation would prove negotiable versus absolute. That ambiguity died in the Strait of Hormuz 48 hours after Chinese destroyers made the catastrophic miscalculation of blocking American vessels in waters Washington has defended since 1949. The question is not whether America will defend its access. The question is whether China will test that commitment again and what the cost of the next test will be for everyone.